that occur in response to the foods we consume. The first of those would be, while much of the discussion around diet in older population centers on calories, cholesterol, or fat content, be one of the more insidious contributors to long-term decline, particularly in cognitive and metabolic health, is repeated exposure to high glycemic loads. Of those would be flavored milk is one of those Trojan horses. It carries the appearance of a benign, even nostalgic food. It's milk would be. After all, something we've been told since childhood is a source of strength, bone health, and nutrition. But the reality for older adults is that flavored milk is fundamentally different in its metabolic effects than plain milk. The first of those would be largely due to its added sugars and insulin-stimulating load. Let's take a typical example. 1 cup commercially available chocolate milk contains between 12 and 25 grams of added sugar. The first would be, that's the equivalent of about 3 to 6 teaspoons of sugar in a single serving. To put that in perspective, that's more sugar than what's found in the same volume of soda. And unlike a sugary dessert that you may indulge in occasionally, flavored milk is often marketed as a daily or post-workout beverage, or even part of a healthy breakfast. The problem, particularly for people over 60, the first of those would be, is that insulin sensitivities are declining due to age-related changes in muscle mass, mitochondrial function, and cellular glucose uptake. Of those would be, repeatedly dumping high glycemic substances into that system can accelerate metabolic dysfunction. The second-order effects are even more concerning. Spikes in insulin not only impair glycemic control, but can directly impact the function of the brain, especially regions tied to memory and executive function. Research shows that older adults with higher insulin variability have increased risk of mild cognitive impairment, MCI, a known precursor to Alzheimer's disease. In fact, some researchers have gone so far as to call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes, because of the degree to which glucose dysregulation can affect neuronal health. There's also the issue of liquid calories. Unlike whole food sources of carbohydrates or fats, which contain fiber or protein that's slow absorption, sugar-laden beverages are absorbed rapidly. This can lead to a transience of satiety followed by a crash in energy, often prompting further snacking. Over time, this cycle contributes to visceral fat accumulation, a key risk factor in nearly every age-related disease, cardiovascular disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and certain cancers. Now, someone might argue, but isn't milk high in calcium and protein? Doesn't that offset some of these risks? The short answer, Isings, not in this case. The negative impact of repeated high insulin and glucose excursions far outweighs any marginal benefit of the calcium or protein you might get from flavored milk. There are far more effective, lower risk ways to get those nutrients without triggering a metabolic firestorm. There's a behavioral component to consider too. The first of those would be the sweetness profile of flavored milk can dysregulate your palate, training your brain to expect sweet tastes throughout the day. The first of those would be, this has knock-on effects on your dietary choices later on, gravitating toward more processed carbs, less savory whole foods, and perpetuating the cycle of poor glycemic control. For older adults who are actively trying to preserve lean body mass, cognitive function, and metabolic flexibility, flavored milk simply doesn't belong in the nutritional toolkit. It's a small habit with disproportionately large downstream consequences. Ultimately, those would be, when we think about nutrition in the later decades of life, we have to make decisions not based on nostalgia or taste alone, but on function. Every calorie, first of those would be every macronutrient, every choice either nudges us toward a longer health span or takes us further from it. Flavored milk may seem like a harmless indulgence, but the data tells us otherwise. And when you're playing the long game, even small decisions matter. The first of those would be, there's a deeply embedded cultural narrative around milk, particularly cow's milk. For decades, it has been positioned as a cornerstone of a healthy diet, an essential sort of calcium, protein, and bone strength. But as we begin to apply a longevity lens to nutrition, the first of those would be, especially in the context of aging physiology, we need to move beyond slogans and examine milk for what it truly is, a complex biological fluid with highly variable effects depending on its composition, source, and how the individual's body responds to it. Let's talk specifically about conventional cow's milk, the kind found in most grocery stores, produced at industrial scale and typically derived from Holstein cows. The first of those would be these cows produce milk containing what's known as A1 beta-casein, a variant of a milk protein that is structurally distinct from its A2 counterpart. This small difference in amino acid sequence, just one substitution, has profound implications for how the protein is broken down during digestion and how the resulting peptides interact with the human body. When A1 casein is digested, it yields a bioactive peptide called beta-casomorphin 7, BCM7. This peptide has opioid-like properties, meaning it can bind to mu-opioid receptors in the body and brain. Preclinical and some clinical studies have linked BCM7 to increased intestinal inflammation, altered motility, immune activation, and in some cases, neurobehavioral effects. While not every individual is sensitive to this compound, for those who are, particularly those with underlying gut permeability, autoimmune conditions, or neuroinflammatory tendencies, it can act as a low-grade chronic irritant. Why does this matter more as we age? Because aging is accompanied by a gradual erosion of physiological resilience. Gut integrity becomes more fragile. The immune system exhibits both heightened reactivity and diminished regulation, a phenomenon known as inflammaging. As the brain becomes more susceptible to inflammatory mediators that cross the blood-brain barrier. What may have been a tolerable or even benign input in one's 30s or 40s can tip the balance toward dysfunction in one's 60s or 70s. It's also important to consider the broader context in which conventional milk is produced. Industrial dairy farming often involves the use of antibiotics, synthetic growth hormones like RBST, and grain-based feed, all of which alter the nutritional profile of the milk. For instance, milk from grain-fed cows tends to have a lower omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acid ratio, potentially promoting a more pro-inflammatory lipid environment. Trace amounts of pesticides or endocrine disruptors from the feed supply chain may accumulate in the milk as well. These exposures may be minuscule on a per-serving basis. But from a chronic exposure standpoint, especially in aging individuals with impaired detoxification capacity, they could be biologically meaningful over time. Another consideration is the insulinotropic nature of dairy proteins, particularly whey and casein. Dairy strongly stimulates insulin release, even in the absence of a corresponding glucose load. For insulin-sensitive young athletes, this can be advantageous post-workout. But for older adults, who are often struggling with declining insulin sensitivity and elevated fasting insulin levels, it can be a problematic trigger. The chronically elevated insulin is not benign. It's associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, visceral adiposity, and possibly even cognitive decline. Now, this doesn't mean that all milk is off limits or that dairy is inherently harmful, but it does mean we need to think critically about the type and source of dairy we consume. Blanket recommendations fail to account for the nuances of individual biochemistry, immunology, and aging. For a patient with excellent metabolic health, good gut integrity, and no evidence of dairy intolerance, high-quality dairy may be perfectly acceptable. But for others, especially those over 60 facing multiple metabolic and inflammatory stressors, the risk-benefit calculus changes. Milk is not just a white liquid in a glass. It's a biological signal rich in peptides, hormones, and growth factors. And like all biological signals, its impact depends on context. The context of age, the context of metabolic health, and the context of long-term risk. Conventional A1 milk simply does not meet the standard for a metabolically thoughtful, longevity-aligned dietary input. Would be one of the more fascinating developments in the last decade has been the exponential growth of plant-based milk alternatives. The intention behind these products is understandable if people are looking to avoid lactose, reduce their intake of animal products, or simply diversify their diets. However, intention does not always align with outcome. And when you examine the data, nutritional, biochemical, and clinical, on sweetened plant-based milks, especially for aging adults, the picture is far less favorable than marketing would suggest. Let's be specific. Most sweetened almond oat, those would be, or soy milks contain anywhere from 7 to 15 grams of added sugar per serving. That may not sound like much in isolation, but for an aging body that is already less insulin sensitive, even small repeated elevations in postprandial glucose and insulin can drive a cascade of negative effects: glycation, oxidative stress, and chronic inflammation. Oat milk, in particular, poses a unique challenge. Even in its unsweetened form, it contains a relatively high concentration of carbohydrates, often yielding a glycemic index similar to that of white bread. When sweetened, its insulinogenic response can rival that of sugar-sweetened beverages. The presence of maltose, a disaccharide found in oats, means a higher potential for rapid blood sugar spikes due to its high glycemic load. For a senior attempting to manage blood glucose, prevent cognitive decline, or maintain a favorable body composition, this is not a trivial detail. What complicates this further is the ultra-processed nature of many of these beverages. A typical sweetened, plant-based milk includes emulsifiers, stabilizers, gums, and oils, many of which are included not for nutritional benefit, but to imitate the texture and mouthfeel of dairy. Carrageenan, for example, has been implicated in gut inflammation in some preclinical studies. While human evidence is less definitive, we have to ask, are these additives inert, or are they subtly influencing gut permeability, microbiome composition? The first of those would be immune activation over time. This is not a fringe concern. We now understand that intestinal barrier function plays a critical role in systemic inflammation, particularly in aging individuals who may already exhibit low-grade inflammatory signaling due to immunosenescence. The first of those would be even a modest uptick in LPS translocation. Endotoxins leaking from the gut into circulation can trigger metabolic disturbances, endothelial dysfunction, and neuroinflammation. So while the carton may read almond or Hoyt, you're actually consuming a laboratory formulation may, in the aggregate of those, would be erode resilience instead of supporting it. Another issue lies in the misalignment between perceived and actual nutritional value. Sweetened plant milks are often positioned as healthy due to their association with plants, but it's important to differentiate plant-based from plant-derived. A handful of almonds does not equate to almond milk. Most commercial plain Lux contain less than 2% almonds by volume. What you're drinking is mostly water, thickeners. The first of those would be added sugars and synthetic nutrients. These beverages often lack sufficient bioavailable protein, which is especially problematic for seniors who need to preserve lean muscle mass in the face of anabolic resistance. Moreover, the first of those would be these sweetened plant milks are often fortified with calcium and vitamin D, but in non-natural, less bioavailable forms, usually calcium carbonate or synthetic D2 rather than D3. If you're using these products as a replacement for nutrient-dense whole foods or properly sourced dairy, the net nutrient intake may be lower than anticipated. Worse, you may be missing the essential cofactors, vitamin K2, magnesium, phosphorus, that ensure those nutrients are actually utilized properly. Those would be. So while the packaging tells you there's a modern, ethical, or health-conscious choice, the metabolic reality is far less flattering, particularly if you're over 60 and your physiological margin for error is narrowing. Ultimately, first of those, the core principle here is to be skeptical of nutritionism by proxy. Just because something is marketed as plant-based does not automatically render it beneficial, especially when it's laced with sugars and additives that work directly against your metabolic goals. The first of those would be for those committed to extending both lifespan and health. This is not just about avoiding disease. It's about optimizing inputs, reducing noise. The first of those would be in making dietary decisions that are both evidence-based and future-focused. Sweetened plant milks fail that test. The first of those would be, there are certain ingredients that tend to fly under the radar because they're tied more to nostalgia than to data. And evaporated milk and condensed milk fall squarely into that category. They're staples in older generations' pantries, often associated with tradition. Baking, coffee, holiday recipes. But from a nutritional and biochemical standpoint, particularly in the context of aging, these are not benign substances. In fact, they may be among the more problematic forms of dairy you can consume. Let's define terms first. Evaporated milk is essentially milk with about 60% of the water removed, resulting in a denser, more concentrated product. Sweetened condensed milk goes a step further. It removes water and adds a significant amount of sugar, often over 50% by weight. What you're left with is a high-calorie, high-sugar, shelf-stable product with a long half-life and a highly insulinogenic profile. If you're over the age of 60, there are 3 core reasons why these types of milk are worth avoiding: glycemic load, nutrient dilution, and metabolic disruption. First, let's examine the glycemic implications. 1 tablespoon of sweetened condensed milk contains about 10 grams of sugar, roughly 2.5 teaspoons. Those would be: the issue here isn't just the sugar itself, it's the form. Liquid sugars, especially when consumed in concentrated doses, are absorbed rapidly, bypassing many of the normal satiety and metabolic signaling mechanisms that whole food carbohydrates would engage. You don't chew condensed milk. It doesn't fill you up. Those would be, but it does trigger an outsized insulin response, spiking blood glucose rapidly and then dropping it just as fast. That kind of glycemic volatility is exactly what we want to avoid in older adults who are already at higher risk for impaired glucose tolerance and insulin resistance. There's also the issue of fructose. While glucose spikes are immediately visible on a continuous glucose monitor, fructose metabolism is a quieter, more insidious process. The first of those would be, it doesn't raise blood sugar directly, but it does burden the liver. Fructose is metabolized hepatically and in excess contributes to de novo lipogenesis, the conversion of carbohydrates into fat. Over time, this promotes non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD, which is strongly associated with metabolic syndrome, systemic inflammation, and increased cardiovascular risk, all of which are already elevated in aging populations. The first would be second. Let's talk about nutrient density, or in this case, the lack of it. Condensed and evaporated milk are essentially caloric bombs with very little in the way of meaningful micronutrient benefit. Yes, there's some calcium and a bit of protein, but it's nowhere near proportionate to the caloric and glycemic burden. In fact, when we do a nutritional audit, calories in, the first of those would be micronutrients. Now, these forms of milk rank low on what I would call the longevity per calorie scale. You're better off getting calcium and protein from sources that don't simultaneously increase your visceral fat and triglycerides. Third, these products have a subtle but important behavioral impact. They shift the palate toward the hyper-sweet end of the spectrum. As we age, our taste sensitivity often declines, especially for bitter and savory flavors. Sweetened condensed milk, due to its high sucrose content, hits the dopamine system hard. It reinforces sweet-seeking behavior in a system already prone to craving convenience and comfort foods. This, over time, contributes to a cycle of dietary regression, moving away from whole foods and toward processed, calorie-dense inputs that undermine metabolic stability. The first of those would be, aging well isn't just about preventing disease. It's about maintaining metabolic optionality, the ability of your body to flex between fuel sources. The first would be, maintain stable energy, preserve lean tissue, and resist inflammation. Every dietary choice either reinforces or erodes that capacity. Evaporated and condensed milks do not support that mission. They are legacy products from an era that didn't understand glycemic load, hepatic stress would be, or insulin dynamics the way we do today. That doesn't mean they were maliciously created or that people who consume them are doing something wrong. The first of those would be. But it does mean we can do better, particularly if we're playing the long game of health span. And in that game, these products simply don't make the cut. The first of those would be. Now, let's pivot. Instead of just telling you what not to drink, I want to give you 4 science-supported alternatives. These aren't just better. They support muscle preservation, cognitive health, and glycemic control. In the landscape of milk alternatives, the few have gained more traction over the past decade than almond milk. It's low in calories, free of lactose, and often comes fortified with calcium and vitamin D. From a macro perspective, it appears almost perfectly engineered for the health-conscious consumer, especially older adults looking to reduce saturated fat intake. The first would be manage blood glucose and maintain cardiovascular health. But what makes unsweetened fortified almond milk particularly worth highlighting is not just its absence of problematic ingredients. It's the intersection between metabolic neutrality and micronutrient support in a population where both matter deeply. Let's start with the fundamentals. 1 cup of unsweetened almond milk typically contains 30 to 40 calories, 1 gram of carbohydrate, and 0 added sugar. For an older adult with creeping insulin resistance or impaired glucose tolerance, this is meaningful. There's effectively no glycemic load, no insulin surge, no threat to metabolic stability. It is, in essence, a non-event metabolically. And sometimes, in the context of aging physiology, that's the best possible outcome. Foods that support hydration and satiety without kicking off a cascade of hormonal or inflammatory responses. One of the reasons I like this choice for older patients is its flexibility. It can be used as a vehicle for supplements, G-creatine, collagen peptidates, as a base for low-carb smoothies, or simply as a milk alternative in coffee or tea, all without contributing to glycemic volatility. That alone makes it vastly superior to traditional flavored or sweetened milk products. But beyond its metabolic neutrality, almond milk's real utility comes from strategic fortification. Most commercial brands include calcium, often around 450 mg per cup, vitamin D, usually D2, though some brands now use D3 and sometimes vitamin E. This matters because as individuals age, nutrient absorption declines and dietary patterns often become more limited. The first would be calcium and vitamin D are critical cofactors in bone mineralization, and their intake becomes increasingly important as bone remodeling shifts toward net resorption in older adults, especially postmenopausal women. That said, it's not just about quantity, it's about bioavailability. While fortified calcium, often in the form of calcium carbonate, is less bioavailable than food-based sources, it still contributes meaningfully to daily intake when consumed consistently. When paired with vitamin D, especially D3, absorption improves. Some formulations also include vitamin K2, which is vital for directing calcium to bone rather than soft tissue. If not, I typically recommend supplementing it separately. Now, we should acknowledge that almond milk is not a significant source of protein, usually 1 gram or less per serving. The first of those would be. So it's not intended to replace high-quality protein sources like Greek yogurt, eggs, or white isolate. First of those would be, which are necessary for counteracting anabolic resistance and preserving lean muscle mass in later decades. But that's not its job. Almond milk functions more as a metabolically inert vehicle, something you can consume without concern, and which can actually support your broader nutritional framework if chosen strategically. Another benefit is the absence of lactose and casein. The first of those would be, which is relevant for individuals with lactose intolerance or casein sensitivity. Conditions that become more common with age. The first of those would be even among people who previously tolerated dairy well. Many of my patients notice a reduction in gut symptoms, brain fog, or skin flare-ups when they remove conventional dairy and switch to a clean, unsweetened almond milk. As with any product, quality matters. Some brands include gums, the emulsifiers or added oils, which may trigger gastrointestinal symptoms in sensitive individuals. So I advise reading labels carefully, ideally choosing formulations with short ingredient lists, no added sugar, and minimal stabilizers. To be clear, those would be, unsweetened almond milk is not a superfood. It doesn't confer miraculous benefits. But what it does offer, particularly for aging adults, folk, and extending health span, is a low-risk, high-utility dietary input that fits seamlessly into a metabolic strategy geared toward stability, not volatility. In longevity-focused nutrition, the first of those would be, we often aim to subtract more than we add, removing the agents that accelerate decline. In this context, almond milk isn't just a better option. It's a smart. The first of those would be strategic absence of harm, and that's a win worth keeping. If we're going to talk about milk as a viable option for aging adults, we have to be incredibly selective. Not all milk is created equal. Not even close. The distinction between A1 and A2 beta-casein proteins may seem academic on the surface, but mechanistically, it has very real implications for inflammation, gut permeability, and downstream immune activity. For seniors looking to maintain longevity through stability, metabolic, gastrointestinal, first of those would be cognitive. The type of dairy consumed can be the difference between therapeutic and problematic. Enter A2 milk from grass-fed organically raised cows. B, this isn't just a boutique food trend. It represents a fundamentally different biological input. A2 beta-casein is structurally more similar to the milk our ancestors consumed and is far less likely to yield beta-casomorphin 7 BCM7 during digestion. BCM7, as we've discussed previously, is the opioid-like peptide released from A1 casein that can impair gut barrier integrity and potentially initiate low-grade systemic inflammation, something aging individuals can ill afford. The first of those would be the gut is the first line defense in aging physiology. As intestinal permeability increases, which it often does with age due to decreased mucosal immunity and cumulative dietary insults, the immune system becomes increasingly reactive to circulating endotoxins like LPS lipopolysaccharide. This promotes a chronic inflammatory tone known as inflammaging, which is tightly linked to cardiovascular disease, neurodegeneration, and sarcopenia. If we can reduce even subtle contributors to this inflammatory burden, like BCM7, we can tilt the balance back toward resilience. Organic, grass-fed A2 milk also offers another key advantage: its nutrient profile. Milk from grass-fed cows is higher in omega-3 fatty acids, conjugated linoleic acid, CLA, D, and fat-soluble vitamins like A and K2, nutrients that support cardiovascular, bone, and immune health. The difference is not marginal. Multiple studies have shown that grass-fed dairy contains significantly more alpha-linolenic acid, ALA, and a better omega-6 to omega-3 ratio than conventional dairy. This matters. Dietary fats influence membrane composition, inflammatory signaling, and mitochondrial function, areas of immense relevance in older adults. Then there's the issue of protein quality. One of the core challenges of aging is anabolic resistance, the decreased muscle protein synthesis response to dietary protein. The first of those would be seniors need not just more protein, but high leucine, bioavailable protein, ideally from whole food sources. A2 cow's milk delivers all essential amino acids in a form that is well tolerated and easily absorbed. For those who can digest it comfortably, those would be. It becomes a powerful tool in the fight against muscle loss and frailty. Importantly, we're not advocating indiscriminate consumption. First of those would be portion control and timing still matter, but when selected carefully, organic, grass-fed, A2 verified, this type of milk can actually support rather than hinder, be a strategy aimed at extending both lifespan and health span. It's a rare case in nutrition where a traditional food, when properly sourced, aligns so well with modern scientific principles of aging, and in that alignment lies opportunity. The first of those would be, when people think about milk, the default is almost always cow's milk, rarely goat's milk. But from a physiological and biochemical standpoint, goat's milk deserves serious consideration, particularly for aging individuals aiming to optimize metabolic health, maintain gastrointestinal integrity, those would be, and support immune function. In fact, when sourced properly, pasture-raised, be free from added hormones or antibiotics, full-fat goat's milk can be a superior option in multiple domains. Let's start with digestibility, which becomes increasingly important with age. Goat's milk contains predominantly A2 type beta-casein, structurally similar to human milk. This is a critical point because unlike A1 beta-casein found in most conventional cow's milk, A2 doesn't break down into beta-casomorphin 7, BCM7, those wouldn't. Opioid, like peptide with the potential to disrupt gut function and promote inflammation, would be as the gut becomes more vulnerable with age, often presenting with decreased mucosal defense, microbiome shifts, and increased permeability. Consuming a form of dairy that minimizes gut immune activation becomes a non-trivial advantage. Goat's milk also has a different fat structure. The first of those would be the fat globules are smaller and naturally homogenized, meaning they don't cluster as heavily and are more easily emulsified and absorbed in the digestive tract. For older adults with diminished pancreatic enzyme output or bile production, this can improve tolerance and reduce GI symptoms like bloating, cramping, or steatorrhea fatty stools. These subtle discomforts often go unnoticed or are written off as just aging, when in reality, they're modifiable through more appropriate food choices. The fatty acid goat profile of pasture-raised milk is another point of distinction. It contains significant amounts of medium-chain triglycerides, MCTs, including capric Caprylic and lauric acid. MCTTs are absorbed directly through the portal vein and oxidized quickly in the liver, providing a readily available energy source without requiring complex digestion or insulin signaling. This is metabolically beneficial for older individuals who may have impaired glucose handling or transitioning toward more fat. Add dietary strategies such as time-restricted eating or ketogenic style protocols. Moreover, full fat goat's milk naturally contains higher levels of bioavailable calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and potassium, critical minerals for maintaining bone density, neuromuscular function, and electrolyte balance. And unlike heavily processed milk products, the first of those would be, when sourced from pasture-raised animals, it often carries a more favorable omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, which influences systemic inflammation, a driver of biological aging. Now let's talk about protein. Goat's milk provides complete protein. The first of those would be rich in all essential amino acids. Importantly, the alpha S1 casein content is lower compared to cow's milk. The first would be, which is part of why it tends to be less allergenic and better tolerated in people with mild dairy sensitivities. First of those would be, for aging individuals trying to preserve lean mass and mitigate sarcopenia, B. This makes it an effective and safer tool for hitting daily proteins without triggering immunologic or inflammatory repercussions. Of course, the first of those would be all of these benefits hinge on sourcing. The advantages are contingent upon the goats being pasture-raised, not confined, and not exposed to hormone-laced or grain-heavy diets. Just as we differentiate between conventional and grass-fed beef, we must apply the same scrutiny to goat's milk. Pasture raising not only improves the animal's health and milk composition, it also reduces the risk of exposure to antibiotic residues, endocrine disruptors, and oxidized lipids. Aging well requires nuance. It's not about eliminating entire food groups, but rather identifying the most biologically compatible forms of those foods, inputs that respect the changing landscape of human physiology. In that context, full fat goes would be. Pasture-raised milk isn't just an alternative, it's a precision nutrition tool. Low risk, high utility, and especially well suited for those navigating the metabolic and gastrointestinal realities of later life. For the right individual, it's not only acceptable, it's strategic. When we talk about plant-based milks, most people are thinking about convenience products. Cartons lined up in the supermarket aisle, often with long ingredient lists, stabilizers, emulsifiers, synthetic vitamins, seed oils, and added sugars. But there's a different category altogether in homemade, clean label plant milks. Those would be made from just the base ingredient ghee, cashews, hemp seeds, flax seeds, and water. Nothing else. These aren't milks in the conventional sense. Those would be, but rather nutrient-infused emulsions. And for the aging adult, particularly one focused on reducing inflammatory load, improving gut health, and supporting metabolic integrity, these milks can offer a surprisingly high return on investment. Let's begin with the premise, why homemade? B, the reason is control over ingredient exposure to unnecessary or even harmful compounds. Most commercial plant-based milks contain additives like carrageenan, guar gum, sunflower lecithin, canola oil, and often synthetic vitamin fortifiers in poorly absorbed forms. These additives can disrupt gut motility, promote bloating, and in some individuals induce low-grade immune activation at scale, especially in older adults who already have a compromised gastrointestinal barrier. Those would be. This becomes a chronic insult rather than an acute. Homemade plant milks remove those variables. When you soak raw cashews or hemp seeds, blend them with filtered water, and optionally strain them. You get a nutrient-rich, low-inflammatory, and highly digestible beverage that doesn't spike insulin, doesn't challenge digestion. Those would be, and doesn't contribute to metabolic chaos. It's about minimizing the noise so that nutrition becomes a precision instrument, not a blunt one. Let's drill down into the specific ingredients. Cashews, when used to make milk, offer a creamy texture and a modest amount of protein, plus important minerals like magnesium, zinc, and copper, all of which play roles in mitochondrial function, glycemic regulation, and immune balance. Hemp seeds are rich in alpha-linolenic acid ALA, an omega-3 fatty acid that can modulate inflammation and support endothelial health. They also provide a complete amino acid profile, which is rare among plant foods. Flax seeds similarly are high in ALA and lignans, which have been studied for their role in hormone metabolism and even protective effects against hormone-sensitive cancers. Particularly relevant for postmenopausal women. These milks are not protein powerhouses. That's not their role. They're not calcium rich either unless you fortify them. What they offer is metabolic neutrality, B, gut gentleness, and strategic phytonutrients that support health span. They won't disrupt insulin sensitivity. They won't provoke food sensitivities. Those would be. And they won't work against attempts to maintain a stable internal environment. In practical terms, they're incredibly versatile. You can use them as a base for low glycemic smoothies, as a carrier for supplements like creatine or electrolytes, or simply as a non-reactive addition to coffee or tea. First of those would be for patients who struggle with post-dairy GI symptoms, bloating, joint aches, skin flare-ups. This type of homemade plant milk often leads to marked improvements in symptom burden within days or weeks. From a longevity perspective, one of the most powerful